Recently, I heard that the twitches in your sleep, like when you're sleeping and your body is twitching a little bit, those sleep twitches are not connected to your dreams. And I thought, what? So I want to know a little bit more. Are sleep twitches connected to dreaming? We challenge the assumption that motor cortex produces twitches during REM sleep. So here they're talking about a REM sleep disorder that makes it so that you have increased muscle tone and exaggerated myoclonic twitching during REM sleep, which is not what I am thinking, but this is actually might bring up an interesting point later on to look into. Because when you're sleeping and you're in REM sleep, your body is like paralyzed because you don't want all of the brain activity in your brain that is like making you do things in the dream, like be translated into physical movements. So, but this looks like this is a different disorder, different from what I was thinking, because this is producing exaggerated twitching during REM sleep. But, I think I need to know more about the topic before I question this. Let's look around. So the reason that I actually thought of this topic was because I listened to a podcast by Unexplainable, which is a Vox Media podcast. It's a great podcast if you're interested. I think this might be the article that goes along with the episode that they did. So in the podcast episode, the question that kind of comes up and brings up this topic is if you're like watching a dog or a cat sleep and you see that they're like twitching in their sleep, a lot of people will assume that they're dreaming and they're in REM sleep and they are like pretending to chase an animal or something, or they're like looking around, or they're doing something fun in their little dog lives and their little dog dreams, and that's why they're twitching. But they are saying in this article that that is not what's happening. So the guy who's kind of leading the research on this is Mark Bloomberg. He's a neuroscientist, and the thing that kind of got him started thinking about this was that he was observing twitching in really young animals who were like basically newborns. And like the common understanding of dreams is that you're dreaming about things that you have already experienced. Like your brain is taking those experiences throughout the day and turning them into connecting neurons and like connecting things and like working stuff out in your dreams. But newborns have like very little actual waking experience. They've been asleep for 90% of their lives, but newborns are still twitching, and a lot of times they're actually twitching more than adults or older animals or people. And he wanted to know like what's up with that. What are they dreaming about if they've never even been awake that much? It's kind of crazy. He surgically disconnected the part of the brain responsible for creating dreams and found no effect at all on the twitches. So the twitches were still going on even after he surgically disconnected that part of their brain. These are called hypnic jerks. He says he has a website that collects different videos of animals doing the sleep twitching. Let's look it up. Here's the website with the sleep twitching videos if you're interested. So it sounds like the traditional way of thinking about twitches and dreams is that the dreams are causing the twitches, but it sounds like the twitches might actually be causing the dream, or they're at least affecting the brain in some way. At the very least, they're providing sensory input to the brain during sleep. So it sounds like the twitches are kind of like a part of the brain's way of figuring things out while you're asleep. This guy feels like studying dreams are a red herring from studying the parts of sleep that actually matter, which I feel like I could probably get behind. It's plausible. Hypnic jerks are also called sleep starts. This says they happen as you are falling asleep. Is that the only time they happen? There are things that may increase the likelihood of experiencing hypnic jerks throughout the night. Excessive caffeine and stimulant consumption, vigorous exercise. What source is this? Sleep Foundation. I don't know why I read these articles that are posted by people selling things. I feel like they're always, maybe not like completely wrong, but I feel like the bias is inexcusable. It makes it feel like I can't trust the source at all. This one should be interesting. Do sleep-related movements contribute to brain development? This article seems like it'll be interesting. And probably helpful, but I don't have time to read it on camera right now, so I'll be back tomorrow with the sweet deets. And I'm back. Let's keep learning. Let me tell you what I found. Alright, as I was leaving yesterday, I'm not sure if I said this or not, but I was wanting to know what REM sleep is exactly, because I felt like if I was going to understand more about sleep twitches, I would need to understand more about REM sleep, because like REM sleep is the primary time when people are twitching, and there's like the rapid eye movement and all that stuff. But then I was like, if the sleep twitches aren't actually related to REM sleep, maybe I don't need to understand it. So this paper right here is kind of the one I have been relying on. This paper was actually written by Mark Bloomberg, the guy I talked about who had talked to Vox Media and given them that podcast episode. So I'm assuming he knows a fair amount. So I've kind of been using this article as my like baseline. I figure if I can just use this article to understand the topic and then research things that I don't know that come up in the topic, that should give me a pretty good idea of the whole topic as a whole. So it took me a long time, but I finally figured out what this abstract is even talking about. So the main thing he wants to cover in this paper is the ontogenetic hypothesis, which actually he wants to kind of add to it. But the ontogenetic hypothesis talks about the part of the brain that starts active sleep. It's talking about how that part of the brain is acting as a go-between like the part of your brain that is actually doing the dreams and the musculature in your body, like twitching. And that hypothesis also talks about how this leads to brain and neuromuscular development. So kind of talking about how everything develops with like your dreams. But the problem that the Mark Bloomberg guy had with this hypothesis was that it doesn't actually address the twitching or its role in development. So it did not directly address the developmental significance of twitching or sensory feedback. So he thinks he needs to go farther. So then in this publication, he's going to talk about how limb twitching produces activation in the somatosensory cortex and the hippocampus. And if we can fully understand how the twitches work, then we'll understand more about how sensory motor things develop in little people, and by that I mean children. And also, they're also thinking that it could be helpful if people have like injuries to limbs where they have lost limb control or things like that. They could study like dream twitches to figure out how to get the control of those limbs back, which is kind of cool. Anyways, so starting off, I was like, the somatosensory cortex. What the heck is that? Because it seems like a lot of this is based on that. So I really wanted to understand the somatosensory cortex, and so I looked into it using this article. So basically what this somatosensory cortex is the part of your brain that controls all of like the feeling and stimulation and like all of the like the itch stimuli. Basically anytime you feel anything with your body, the somatosensory cortex is what is controlling that, or what is like receiving those impulses. Hot, cold, sharp, smooth, all the physical touch stuff. It seems like this article or this publication was dealing specifically with like itching, but I couldn't figure out like if they were just talking about like using itching as like a stimulant so they could research the effect, or if they were actually trying to figure out like what itching actually is, which is actually a really interesting question. Like, what is itching and why do you do it? And why do you need to scratch it? In this article, I also learned about a homunculus, which I hadn't really learned about before. So a homunculus is a word for a tiny man. I don't know where that came from, but homunculus basically just means like tiny human. And I guess back in the day, they used to believe that embryos were like fully formed tiny humans that just grew into adults. And I guess that's where the word homunculus comes from. Anyway, so they used this homunculus image to kind of show how the somatosensory cortex is connected to each individual part of the body, because there are specific parts of the brain that are dedicated to specific parts of the body. Like this part of the brain is dedicated to the hand, and this part of the brain is dedicated to lips, and so on. But there are different parts that are larger or smaller based on how sensitive that part of the body is. So the hand part is large, although it doesn't really look large in this picture, because the hands are very sensitive, and the leg part is kind of small because legs aren't that sensitive. Lips are hecka sensitive, and so on and so forth, which is kind of cool. Where was that other homunculus I saw that was real weird looking? This isn't what I read. Huh, I must not have put that source down. Anyways, there was a homunculus that was real funky looking. So one interesting part about this homunculus, well, not the homunculus part, but just like how the different sections of the brain are responsible for different parts of the body and how they feel things and sense things, is that if you damage that part of the brain, then that part of the body will also be kind of like the nerves will get turned off. So if you damage the part of your brain that is responsible for your arm, you will lose pretty much all the feeling in your arm. So you can still control it, but you won't be able to feel anything in it. And so this is why if somebody loses a limb, they get the phantom limb effect, because their brain still thinks there's a limb there, but their body limb is actually missing. So the brain is like, yeah, I can still feel it. And your body's like, no, there's nothing there. So it's kind of cool. So this was the part of the research where I was kind of finishing up on the somatosensory cortex, and I wanted to look at the REM sleep a little bit more, but specifically like the temporary paralysis that goes along with REM sleep. But then I thought, wait, it might not be that relevant. So I kind of switched back to the original publication by the Bloomberg guy and kept looking at that. So apparently, according to him, the theory that sleep plays a functional role in learning and memory is actually controversial. It's generating controversy. I didn't realize, I thought that was pretty well accepted and established fact that sleep helps you learn and helps your memory to grow. Is there controversy about that? Now I want to know about that. So I'm also confused about what the actual title of this effect, like twitching effect, is, because this guy is calling it the myoclonic twitching, but I think before I referenced it as the hypnic jerks, and then there was also somebody who was calling it sleep myoclonus, which I think this might be a disorder or something. So I'm not sure which one of these is actually referencing what we are referencing. I didn't get a chance to find out. I went down a bit of a rabbit hole looking into this guy, Mark Bloomberg, and it turns out that his CV is 46 pages long. He's got his like educational street cred, and it's 46 pages long, which I thought was, I don't know if that's normal for a professor, but yeah. Right here, they start talking about complete loss of muscle tone in dreams, which he was like, this is one of the striking features of sleep that is well known, like bizarre dreams or complete loss of muscle tone or rapid eye movement. And I was like, what the heck is complete loss of muscle tone? It turns out that's just your, I guess the technical term for sleep paralysis, where your muscles have lost their tone, which I guess is like your ability to control them. So if your muscles have tone, you can control them. If they have no tone, then you can't control your limbs or your muscles. So I looked into it using this article by Stanford Sleep Health, and wouldn't you know it, there's a little drama. A lot of the stuff that they're saying in this article is like, I felt like it was kind of not contradicting, just not really going along with what the other guy was saying about sleep and how it works. So like an individual may awaken and become quickly alert. Like if you're sleeping and you're having a dream and you're twitching, and then you wake up and you can tell about why you were twitching in your dream. So it's like if you're kicking and flailing and sitting up, or you're twitching, and then all of a sudden you wake up and you're like, oh, this is what was happening in my dream, and this is why I was kicking and flailing in that particular way. I was like, that seems like the kicking and flailing would be related to the dream. I think this article by Stanford Health is in particular referencing behavior disorders, but this kind of got me thinking about like sleepwalking, or people who are like fighting their spouse in bed because they're dreaming and they think there's someone attacking them in the dream, so they start fighting their spouse. And I'm kind of like, this is making me feel like the twitching is related to the dreams. Like, what is that other guy saying? So I think I actually found an answer for that, but I'll come back to that. So as I was reading, he starts talking about how it's conspicuous that twitching in adults is a thing, but it's more conspicuous that little infants twitch because they spend 50% of their life sleeping. So like, what do they have to dream about? I think we talked about this before. Human newborns are in active sleep for 8 hours each day, which active sleep, he's talking about REM sleep. So that's 8 hours of twitching every day for newborn humans. Okay, and so then this kind of chart kind of cleared it up for me a little bit. So like the original understanding of how dreams work is that you would dream, and then in your dream you would be chasing rabbits, and then your body would twitch. But then this hypothesis came along where they were thinking, oh, well, the brain stem is having activity, and that leads to dreams, and then those dreams lead to like sleep paralysis or loss of muscle tone, and then it's like twitching is just kind of like the little tiny bits of like muscle tone loss, little tiny bits of the dream escaping out of the muscle tone loss and just kind of being like little byproducts. And then, so this is the ontogenetic hypothesis, which I think the ontogenetic hypothesis is in blue, the original one, and then the red is his kind of addition to that hypothesis, which is that the brainstem activity is contributing to the dreams and also the twitching at the same time. So they're not causing each other, they're both happening at the same time. So the brainstem activity is going up into the brain to create the dream, but it's also going down into the body to create the twitches. And so what he's saying is that the twitches are leading to more dream activity. So if your brain is working and it's sending impulses down into your body, and your body is twitching, those twitches are influencing what dreams you're actually having. So if you're twitching like this, it might inspire your brain to start dreaming like you're punching someone. Or if your legs are twitching, it might inspire your brain to start thinking like you're running, which kind of does support the whole like sleepwalking hypothesis, or like fighting a spouse. It makes a little more sense. It makes me feel a little less skeptical that the Stanford thing had it wrong, and just that they didn't understand the full story. So I think we might have referenced this before as well, but right here is where he's separating the cortex of the animals, splitting their brain in half to see if the twitching would continue, and it did. When Villablanca transected the adult cats, reported periods of active sleep, including muscle twitches, that could not be distinguished from similar periods in non-transected cats. So the cats that didn't have the brain surgery twitched just as much as the cats that did have brain surgery. After they did it to cats, they did it using 1-week-old rats, which is sad. Sad, poor little rats. And they feel like this is pretty substantial evidence that it's not like the brain, like dreams aren't causing them twitching. I feel like, I don't know, I'm just a skeptic, but I feel like there could be other reasons for why the twitching would be caused, and it could still be caused even if you separated the brainstem. Maybe I'm crazy, but that's just my thought. Anyways, I'm going to do a little more research, and then I'll get back to you this evening with what I found, and that should wrap up this video. I didn't actually do that much more research. I mainly just continued to read this one article. So this is the part where he explains more about the ontogenetic hypothesis and kind of elaborates, like builds on what was already there. He kind of reiterates that it doesn't really make sense that you can only develop the brain in active sleep. Like there has to be a way to develop the brain without active stimulation. And then he kind of talks about how like it's common knowledge that like the sensory threshold during sleep is dampened. Like you can't hear as well during sleep, you can't taste as well during sleep, you don't feel things as well on your body during sleep. And so he's thinking like, what if these twitches are also dampening? Like if your sense of touch in your hand is dampening and then your hand is twitching during sleep, is that twitch sensory also going to be dampened? And also he wanted to make sure that they could demonstrate that the twitching that is actually going to the brain is actually doing something to the brain and not just like impulses or signals. Apparently the research about like sensory dampening is more supported during a REM or active sleep. So I pulled kind of a dumb person moment. I was like reading this, the increased sensory threshold during sleep, because it was like right here he talks about where the sleep sensory inputs are dampened during sleep, and then right here he's like the increased sensory threshold, and I was like, wait, what how would, what are you talking about? Sensory threshold is increased during sleep, but he's just talking about how it takes more sensory input to stimulate things in the brain during sleep, which was my bad. So one of the ways they got the first like strong evidence they got that the twitches are actually useful was in these infant rats in Sweden, and they were able to show that the like when the baby rats were twitching and their limbs were touching nearby objects, it produced sensory motor circuits in their spinal region. And then they hooked up these rats to little brain scanner things, and they were able to see that the limb twitches are triggering spindle bursts in the somatosensory cortex. So they were able to like see these little spindle bursts in the brain light up as they were watching the twitches, and then they were actually able to manually stimulate these little, call them spindle bursts, by like either stroking the limbs or by like flexing the wrist on the animals, and that was also lighting up that same area of the brain. I don't know if I feel like this is crazy relevant, but apparently when little human babies are learning how to hold up their necks, they twitch. There's a one muscle in their neck that you can isolate that twitches over 38,000 times a day, which is kind of wild. And then I think this was in rats. I don't know, it's hard to tell, but they were also able to isolate this one area in the somatosensory cortex that had 40,000 or 4,000 spindle bursts every day. And they're kind of using this as evidence that because there's such a high level of activity, it has to mean something. It's hard to dismiss, which I feel like, yeah. So he makes the point down here somewhere that it's one thing to study like brain twitches in sleep and be like, oh, the brain's moving and it's isolated, it's doing these movements, but like how is that different than just walking around during the day and getting feedback to your brain when your body is moving all over the place? And the reasons he gave were that it might have something to do with like segregating the different limbs and isolating those specific parts of the brain and muscle. Like during the day, like I'm moving both hands and my arms and my elbows and my head all around, and it's like there's a lot going on. And so when you're sleeping, your brain has the ability to target specific like limbs or appendages and just get like movements very isolated from those. And there's less background noise as well, which is kind of what I was saying before. Like there's a lot going on in your brain when you're awake, but when you're asleep, there's much less actually happening in the brain. So that might be another reason why this is happening when you're asleep versus when you're awake, versus just like the regular input you get during the day. So I ran out of time to keep researching this, but I heard someone say in a podcast, I think it was actually that main podcast that I was listening to, that were talking about how there is some company that is using twitches to kind of like help robots fine tune their motor skills. And so they use like little twitches to help robots learn to move better, which I thought sounded super cool. But I couldn't find any like articles or anything talking about that. And I feel like the only people who would actually be doing that are Boston Dynamics, because they're awesome and seems like they are by far the furthest along in the robot to human journey. Anyways, them's all my notes. Hope you had a good time. I'll catch you on the flippity flip. Peace.